I have told this story exactly once before to my brother Hatch on the night he asked me why I'd never married. He listened all the way through without saying a word, and when I finished he looked at me across the fire and said, "Cale, you are the stubbornest fool God ever put on a horse." I didn't argue with him. I couldn't. This is that story. The one about 15 years of silence and what it costs a man. The one about Vera Lund. I first saw Vera Lund when she was 19 years old and I was 22. And she was standing in the yard of her father's homestead with a bucket of creek water, and an expression on her face that told you she had been doing hard work since before the sun came up, and expected to be doing hard work long after it went down, and she didn't mind either of those facts at all. That was Silas Lund's oldest daughter, compact and still and plain-spoken, with brown eyes that looked right at a thing without flinching and hair the color of late summer, hay pinned up neat under a sun-faded bonnet. She wasn't the kind of woman you called pretty right away. She was the kind of woman you looked at for a full minute before you understood that pretty was the wrong word entirely. I had ridden over to return a pair of Silas's fence posts that had come loose in the spring flood and tangled in my lower wire. Silas wasn't home. Vera took the posts from my saddle without ceremony, set them against the barn wall and said, "Thank you, Mr. Rourke. Tell your father we'll square the grazing fees by the end of the month." I was the one who'd ridden over. I was the one holding the fence posts. I was 22 years old and the Rourke spread was already half mine by labor if not yet by deed. And Vera Lund thanked me, told me what her father planned to do, and went back to her bucket. I rode home thinking about her for the whole 3 miles. That is how it began. Slowly, the way things begin out here, a nod at church, a word at the feed store in Seavers Ford, her father and mine talking fence lines at the edge of our shared range while Vera and I stood a little apart, and I tried to find things to say that wouldn't sound foolish. She made it easier than I deserved. She had a way of listening that was completely level, no performance. No pretending she'd understood when she hadn't. No laughing at things that weren't funny just to be agreeable. When she asked you something, she wanted the actual answer. When she said something back, she meant it. In a world full of people who talk sideways at each other, Vera Lund talked straight, and I was 22 years old and already half in love with the directness of her before I'd admitted to myself that I was in love with anything at all. We had 3 years of it. That's the span I hold in my chest whenever I let myself, 3 years of Sundays after church, of riding the fence line together when Silas let her come, of her sitting on her father's porch in the long summer evenings while I found reasons to still be there when the light failed. We talked about the land, about cattle prices and weather and the winters out here on the high plateau, and slowly about other things, about what she wanted, which was to teach the children in whatever schoolhouse would have her, and about what I wanted, which was the Rourke Ranch to be something worth handing down. We didn't talk about each other. Not directly. That was where I failed her, though I didn't understand it for a long time. I was not a man who found words easily. My father wasn't either. Hatch used to say the Rourke men came out of the womb with their mouths already shut. And I had grown up in a house where feeling a thing and saying a thing were so far apart they might as well have been in different counties. I knew what Vera was to me. I knew it by the 3rd summer clearly enough that it ought to have been said out loud, ought to have been named and offered plainly. But I was 24 years old, and the land was everything I knew how to talk about, and Vera Lund was something beyond anything I knew how to talk about, and so I didn't. I kept showing up on her father's porch, and looking at her across the fence line, and keeping everything I felt locked in my chest like a man who doesn't trust his own voice. She waited. That is what I know now looking back. She waited for me to say it, and she was not the kind of woman who was going to say it first on behalf of a man who couldn't manage to say it himself. A month passed, 3 months. The autumn came and the fence line work was done for the year, and my reasons for riding by the Lund place got thinner. I told myself I would say it in the spring. I told myself there was time. There wasn't. The following February, a man named Gideon Ware came through the valley on his way north, a school teacher out of Cheyenne looking to settle somewhere with a school that needed a teacher. He wasn't much to look at, lean and sharp-faced, with the look of a man who spent more time with books than with horses, but he was easy with words in a way I never was, and he had a use for them. He stayed in Seavers Ford for 2 weeks. He talked to Vera at church. He talked to her at the feed store and at the dry goods, and on her father's porch, while I sat on my own, spread 3 miles away, not saying a word to anybody. By March she had agreed to go with him to a school up in Cutter's Bluff, a day's ride north of Dray Valley, where they needed a teacher who could handle 2 grades at once. She was going as a school teacher, not as his wife. I told myself that ought to ease the thing in my chest. It didn't. She came by the work spread the morning before she left. I was mending saddle leather on the front step, and I looked up, and there she was on the road, and the look on her face was not angry, not tearful, just very still. The way she looked when she was waiting for you to say something that needed saying. I didn't say it. I said her father's property line was drifting north with the spring thaw, and I'd ride it back if he needed. I said Cutter's Bluff was good country. I said I hoped the school would suit her. She stood in my road for a moment after I stopped talking, just long enough that I knew she had come there for a different conversation, and then she said, "Thank you, Cale. I expect we'll see each other when I come back to visit," and she turned and walked away. That was April of the year I turned 27. I did not see Vera Lund again for 15 years. In that time I built the Rourke Ranch into something my father would have respected. I added the north pasture, bred up the herd, put proper walls on the south barn that had been one hard winter from collapsing since before I was born. I hired 2 good hands, Doss Halley and a younger man named Petrie, and they were loyal and reliable and didn't talk much, which suited me. I served 1 term on the county water board and declined a second. I went to church most Sundays and ate supper alone 6 nights out of 7. I was not unhappy, exactly. I was a man who had organized his life around work, because work was something he was good at, and something that left him no room to think about what else he might have organized it around. I did not hear much about Vera in those years. She'd stayed in Cutter's Bluff, that much I knew. She'd gotten the school there and she'd kept it. Silas Lund mentioned her sometimes when I rode by the homestead to check his fence, the way a father mentions a child who is doing well and is far away, and he is proud of her, and a little lonely about it at the same time. Silas was a good man. I always stayed a little longer on those visits than I needed to, for no reason I could name. Then one September, 15 years after that April morning on my front step, Hatch rode over from his spread across the ridge and told me Silas Lund had died. Quietly in his sleep, the way a man who has worked his whole life is sometimes mercifully allowed to go. He was 67 years old, and his homestead was clear of debt, and his fields were in order, and he had made his peace. "Vera'll be coming to settle the place," Hatch said. "Heard she's not married, heard she might be looking to sell." I said that was a hard thing, losing Silas. Hatch looked at me with the expression he had been giving me for 20 years, and didn't say anything else. I went back to mending fence. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, on the stage from Seavers Ford, with 2 leather cases and a trunk, and the same way of stepping off a coach that she'd had at 19, not hesitant, not rushed, just deliberate, like a woman who knew where her feet were going and didn't need to announce it. I wasn't there when she arrived. I heard about it from Doss, who'd been in town for grain, who mentioned it the way a man mentions whether Lund girl's back, the one who went north, as if I didn't know which one. I gave it 3 days. That is what I told myself. I was being respectful, giving her time to settle into the homestead, to grieve her father in private, to do what needed to be done without a neighbor showing up uninvited. 3 days was the right amount of time, a decent interval. That was all it was. On the 4th morning, I saddled up and rode over. The homestead looked smaller than I remembered, the way places always look smaller once the person who filled them is gone. The kitchen garden was overgrown at the edges and the porch step had a crack in it that Silas hadn't gotten to, and there was a stack of her father's tools piled neatly beside the barn door, sorted, the things to keep, the things to sell. She'd been working. Of course she had. She came around the side of the barn when she heard my horse, and she stopped when she saw who it was. Just for a moment, a fraction of a beat, the way you stop when something you've been braced for arrives and your body has to recalibrate. Then she kept walking, and when she reached me she looked up at me with those same level brown eyes and said, "Cale Rourke." "Vera," I said, "I was sorry to hear about your father." "Thank you." She looked at the tools she'd laid out, then back at me. "He went easy. I'm glad for that. He was a good man." "He was." She paused. "You look the same." "You don't," I said, and then I felt the blood go to my ears because that came out wrong, and she saw the look on my face and something shifted in hers. Not a smile exactly, more like a tightening at the corners of her eyes that I had once known meant she was amused. "I look older," she said. "So do you, I just didn't say it." "That's fair," I said. That was how the first conversation went. I helped her carry the tool stack into the barn out of the weather, and I told her about the fence line, and that her father's north gate post had been leaning since July and I'd been meaning to set it right, and she said she'd appreciate that. I rode home with the feeling that I'd said everything practical there was to say, and none of the things that actually needed saying, which, I recognized, was exactly how things had always gone between me and Vera Lund. But I went back. Not because I had planned to, or not only because of that. The homestead genuinely needed work. There was a fence post, and then there was a water trough that had cracked in the summer heat and needed new wood set, and Silas's old gelding had thrown a shoe, and I had the tools for it. Each time I came with a purpose, with something I could point to and say, "Here is the reason I rode over." And each time Vera met me in the yard, practical and even-handed and plain, and we worked alongside each other with a competence that 20 years of separate labor had given us both. And by the end of each afternoon, I had stayed longer than I'd planned and ridden home in the dark trying to figure out when exactly that had happened. She talked more than she used to. Or maybe she'd always talked this much, and I'd been too busy managing my own silence to notice. She talked about the school in Cutter's Bluff, the children who came in from the outlying ranches, the way the older ones sometimes resented it and then quietly stopped resenting it, the ones she remembered particularly. She talked about the high plateau country up north, similar to Dray Valley but different in ways she could describe precisely. The light, the color of the grass in late August, the particular way the wind came off the ridgeline before a storm. She noticed things. She'd always noticed things. She would crouch down beside a plant at the edge of Silas's kitchen garden and identify it by its root system, and tell you which year it had spread from the original planting and why, and do it in a voice that wasn't showing off, just reporting what she could see. I had forgotten how much I liked listening to her. On the 8th day, I showed up and she had been crying. Not openly, she would not have let me see that, but her eyes were red-edged, and she was moving through the work with the slightly too deliberate pace of a person keeping themselves in motion against something heavy. Silas's personal things. She'd been going through them. There was a box on the porch table with a few letters in it, and a pocket watch and a woman's brooch that must have been her mother's. I didn't say anything about the crying. I picked up the water trough board I'd brought and went to the barn. When she came in a half-hour later with 2 tin cups of coffee, I took one and kept working. We didn't talk about Silas or about the box or about the brooch. We talked about whether the east fence needed restringing before winter or whether it would hold one more season, which was a real question, and one she'd need the answer to if she was selling the place, and I gave her my honest read on it. After a while she said, "I didn't think you'd come back." "After what?" She looked at me steadily. "After the first day. I thought you'd come by, be decent about it, and that would be that." I kept my eyes on the board I was planing. I had work to do here. You've had work to do every day for the past 8 days, she said. The place needed it. Kale. I put the plane down. I looked at her. In the barn light, with the coffee cup in her hand and the red still faint at the corners of her eyes, she looked like something time had kept for me on purpose, which I knew was a foolish way to think, and thought it anyway. I know, I said, which wasn't an answer, which was the best I had at that moment. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd gotten the actual answer even if it wasn't the full one. All right, she said, and we went back to work. She had planned to stay 3 weeks. That's what she told me on the second day when I asked her 3 weeks to settle the estate and put the homestead on the market, and then back to Cutter's Bluff and the school. She had a life up there. She had responsibilities. She said all of it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, without complaint and without particular emotion, and I said that sounded like a reasonable plan and went on helping her stack the winter wood. What I didn't say, what I did not know how to say, was that the idea of her leaving the valley again was producing in my chest a specific sensation that I hadn't felt since I was 26 years old sitting on my porch watching her walk away, and that I had spent 15 years convincing myself I had burned out of me, and apparently had not. The third week came. We had settled into a pattern by then. She worked the homestead mornings. I rode over after midday. We worked until the light failed, and she fed me supper because it was only civil when a man had been helping with your fence, and I ate it at her father's kitchen table, and we talked for an hour after, and then I rode home in the dark. It was the most uncomplicated I had felt in 15 years, which told me something I was not ready to say out loud. On the Wednesday of the third week, she told me she'd had an offer on the homestead. A cattleman out of Seaver's Ford, a man I knew slightly decent enough, would keep the land in use. The price was fair. She was going to take it. When, I said, I'll sign the papers Friday, leave Saturday morning. She said it evenly. The school starts back mid-month. I need a few days to get ready. I said that was good. I said the cattleman would keep the land upright. I said I was glad she'd gotten a fair price. She looked at me across her father's kitchen table for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, I should get the last of the east fence checked before I go. Will you ride it with me tomorrow? Yes, I said. We rode it Thursday. The whole east line, 2 miles of it, through the late summer grass going yellow at the tips, with the high plateau ridgeline showing blue-gray on the north horizon, and the light flat and clear the way it gets out here in September when the season is changing. Vera rode easily. She'd kept a horse in Cutter's Bluff. It showed. She knew how to read a fence line too, spotting loose wire and listing posts the way a woman who grew up doing it never forgets. We stopped 3 times to tighten wire. We barely talked. On the way back, near the south corner where Silas had planted 2 cottonwoods that were now tall enough to give shade, she stopped her horse and looked out over the valley and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I always thought I'd come back here to stay. I held my horse still. What changed? You didn't say anything, she said, quiet, not angry, just the fact of it laid out plain. That morning I came by your place. I came there to give you the chance to say it, and you told me about my father's fence line. The cottonwood leaves turned in the light above us. My horse moved 1 hoof and settled. I know, I said. I waited 3 years, she said. I wasn't going to wait longer than that and become someone who waited her whole life for something that was never going to be said. That was right, I said. That was the right thing to do. She looked at me. Was it? You deserved better than what I gave you. A man who couldn't find the words. Cale, her voice was careful. You know what I was hoping you'd say just then. I looked at her across the gap between our horses, in the shade of those 2 cottonwoods her father had planted 20 years ago, with the valley spread out below us going gold in the September light. I had said the wrong thing for 3 years when I was young. I had said nothing for 15 years after that. I was 42 years old, and my brother had called me the stubbornest fool God ever put on a horse, and I was beginning to think Hatch had been conservative. "I know what you were hoping," I said. "You were hoping I was going to tell you that it wasn't right, that you should have waited." "Yes," she said. "Then I'll tell you that." I met her eyes. "It wasn't right. You should have waited. I should have said it. I knew what you were to me, and I didn't have the words, and I let you walk away rather than stumble through saying it wrong, and that was the worst thing I ever did. And I have thought about it most days for 15 years. The valley lay still around us. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky to the north. "That's the most I've ever heard you say at once," Vera said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Don't get used to it," I said. "I'll be back to monosyllables by morning." And there it was, that tightening at the corners of her eyes, that almost smile that I'd been missing for 15 years without knowing I'd been missing it specifically. "You have 24 hours, she said. "After that I'm signing papers and leaving." "Then I'll need to be quicker than I used to be," I said. We rode back to the homestead in the long afternoon light, and I helped her with the last of the barn work and ate supper at Silas's table one more time, and this time we talked differently. Not about fence lines and cattle prices, but about the 15 years themselves, about Cutter's Bluff and what she had built there, about the ranch and what I had built here, about the years that had gone and the cost of the silences in them. She talked and I listened, and I talked in the stumbling way I have always talked about things that matter, and she listened the way she had always listened, completely level, taking in the actual thing, not the version of it you wish you'd said. By the time I rode home it was late, and the stars were out over Dray Valley in that thick autumn way they have when the air turns cold, and I was 42 years old, and I felt, for the first time since I was 26, like the future was something I might be going toward rather than away from. But Vera Lund had always done what she said she would do. That was the thing about her. You could not count on her saying something she didn't mean, and you could not count on her not doing what she'd said. She had signed the papers with the Seavers Ford cattlemen. She had a school full of children waiting in Cutter's Bluff. She had a life she'd built from the ground up, entirely on her own, while I was building mine 3 miles south of here. And it was a real life, and it deserved its real consideration. She was leaving Saturday. I knew that. I had known it all week. And I had spent the 2 miles home from her father's kitchen table telling myself that I had said what needed saying, that she had heard it, that she was a grown woman who would make her own decision, and I should respect that, and that the respect was the thing she had always been owed, and the thing I had always failed to give her, and that showing up at her door with 15 years of regret and asking her to stay was not respect. It was one more way of making her situation about me. That was what I told myself. Friday came and went. I did not ride to the homestead. I worked the south pasture and rehung the barn gate and checked the water in the stock tank and told myself I was doing the right thing. Friday night I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark in my father's house that was now my house, and I thought about Vera Lund standing in my road 27 years ago at 22, with a bucket of creek water and a plain-spoken manner and brown eyes that looked at things without flinching. And I thought about her on her father's porch in the long summer evenings. And I thought about that April morning when she stood in my road and waited for me to say the thing, and I talked about fence lines instead. And I thought about what Hatch had said across the fire. Stubbornest fool God ever put on a horse. I got up at 5:30. I built the fire and made coffee and drank it standing, and then I put on my coat and went to the barn and saddled up while it was still dark, and I rode out before the sun had cleared the ridgeline. The valley road runs east out of the Lund homestead and climbs a long, gentle grade before it drops towards Seavers Ford and the stage junction. If a wagon was leaving Saturday morning, loaded and ready, it would be on that grade by mid-morning. I pushed gravel, my roan, 15 years old and still sound, up through the back country cut that saves a mile off the road, The one I've ridden so many times in the dark I could do it with my eyes shut. The sun came up while I was on the ridge, orange and flat and cold, the valley spreading out below me in the early light with the first frost white on the grass. I came down off the ridge and hit the valley road at the long grade just as the wagon crested it. She saw me coming. She pulled the horse up, a hired rig from the livery in Seaver's Ford, a bay with a white blaze, and she sat in the wagon seat with her 2 leather cases behind her and her trunk lashed in the bed, and she watched me ride up the grade to her without any particular expression on her face, except the one that meant she was waiting to see what I was going to do. I pulled Gravel up alongside the wagon and stopped. The morning was very quiet, a meadowlark somewhere down in the grass. The frost melting off the yellow tips of the range. "Don't go," I said. Vera looked at me. "I know you have a school," I said. "I know you have a life up there and it's a real one, and I'm not saying it isn't. I know you signed papers on the homestead and that's done and right. I know I don't have any claim on you, and I know I gave up any right to ask you for anything 15 years ago. I know all of that." I stopped. Gravel shifted under me. "But I am asking anyway. Stay. Not because you have to, not because you owe me anything. Because I am done being a fool about it, and you deserve to know what you would be staying for." She sat with the reins in her hands and looked at me for a long moment. The meadowlark sang twice and stopped. "What would I be staying for, Kale?" she said. Her voice was quiet and even. The real question, the one she'd been waiting 15 years for the actual answer to. "Me," I said. "The ranch, Dray Valley, all of it, but mainly me. I want you here. I have wanted you here for 20 years, and I have been too closed-mouthed and too proud and too afraid of saying it wrong to say it right. And if I let you drive that wagon over this ridge and out of this valley, I will spend the next 20 years exactly the same way I spent the last 15, except I will know that I had the chance to say it and I said it too late, and that is something I am not willing to do." Vera did not say anything for a moment. She looked out over the valley, at the frost still lying in the low shadows, at the cottonwoods along her father's fence line showing yellow, at the ridgeline blue-gray against the morning sky. "The school board in Cutter's Bluff will need time to find someone," she said. "I know it. I'd want to go back and finish the term, give them fair notice." "That's right," I said. "That's the decent thing. And the Seaver's Ford cattleman has the homestead. I can't undo that." "No," I said, "but the Rurk spread has a south-facing room my father built for my mother that has never had anyone in it. It has 4 windows and a view of the valley, and I have been using it to store halter rope for 15 years, which is a waste." I paused. "It could be a classroom or a sitting room, or whatever you want it to be. It is a good room." Something moved across her face. Not the almost smile this time, something slower than that, something that came from deeper down. She looked at me for a long moment, and I sat on gravel on the valley road in the September morning and let her look, because she was Vera Lund and she would make this decision with her whole mind, not half of it, and she deserved the time. Then she set the brake on the wagon and wrapped the reins twice around the post, and she climbed down from the wagon seat, not quickly, not performing anything, just with that same deliberate, unhurried way she had of doing things, and she stood in the road beside my horse. "You're going to have to learn to say things," she said, looking up at me. "Not all at once, but more than you have been." "I'm working on it," I said. "I can see that." She looked at the road and then back up at me. "I'll finish the term in Cutter's Bluff, 4 weeks, and then I'll come back." I got down off gravel. We stood in the road in the September morning with the frost on the grass and the meadowlark starting up again somewhere in the valley below, and I took her hand. That was all. Her hand in mine, small and work-roughened and warm, and she looked up at me and did not look away. 4 weeks, I said. 4 weeks, she said. I rode back to the Rurk spread with the sun climbing full over the ridge, and the valley lit up gold in the way it only gets in September, when the season is turning, and the light has that particular slant to it that makes the grass look like something precious. I put gravel in his stall and gave him his grain, and then I stood in the south-facing room and looked at the halter rope and the dust and the 4 windows showing me the valley, and I thought about what it was going to take to clear all of that out. A lot of work, good. I started that afternoon. Vera came back 31 days later, a day earlier than we'd said, which I chose not to comment on and she chose not to explain. She came on the stage to Seavers Ford and hired a rig for the last stretch, and I heard the wagon on the road before I saw it, and I was in the yard when she came through the gate. The south-facing room had 4 windows and no halter rope, and a clean floor, and a small iron stove I'd set in the corner, and she stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment without saying anything. "It's a good room," she said. "I told you," I said. She set her cases down and walked to the window that faced the valley and stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides, looking out at the grass going yellow in the October light, at the cottonwoods along the ridge turning full gold, at the Rourke Range running south as far as you could see. "My father would have thought this was reasonable," she said. "Silas was a practical man," I said. "Yes," she turned from the window, "so am I." We were married at the county clerk's office in Seavers Ford 6 weeks later, on a Friday morning in November when the first real snow was coming off the ridge. Hatch stood up with me. Vera had her sister's girl, who'd come down from the north for it. The clerk was a man named Aldous Priest who'd been doing this work for 30 years, and had the manner of someone who had seen every combination of nervous and certain that 2 people could present, and he looked at us across his desk, me standing there like a man who has made his decision and intends to keep it, and Vera standing there like a woman who has made hers, and he said, "I can see there's not much point in me making a speech," and did the thing in 4 minutes flat, which was exactly right. We rode home through the snow. I am not a man who finds words easily. Vera knows this. She has always known it, and she made her decision about it with her whole mind open, the way she makes all her decisions, and she stays. I say more now than I used to, not fluently. Not without stops and corrections and the occasional misfire, but more. She tells me when I need to say something and haven't said it plainly, the same way she tells me when the south gate needs rehanging, and I have come to value both pieces of information equally. She turned the south-facing room into a schoolroom for the 2 ranch families with young children on the neighboring spreads, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays it has the sound of a working schoolroom in it, which is a sound I did not know I had been missing from this house until it arrived and made the whole place feel different, fuller, like something that had been half-finished for 20 years had finally had its last work done. Last spring I rode the fence line with my brother Hatch, the east fence, the one I'd ridden with Vera the September before, and at the south corner where Silas had planted those 2 cottonwoods, Hatch stopped his horse and looked out over the valley for a moment. "Well," he said, "you got there eventually." 15 years, I said. "Better than never." He looked at me sideways. "She put up with a lot." "She did," I said. "Stubbornest fool God ever put on a horse." "Hatch," I said. "I'm just saying what I said before." "You've made the point," I said. "Ride the fence." He rode the fence. But he was smiling when he did it, and so was I, and the valley was green below us in the late spring light, and the Rourke spread ran south as far as you could see, and when we got back to the house Vera was on the porch with coffee, and she handed me a cup and I stood beside her in the morning sun and did not say anything, which was all right, because some things are said well enough by a man standing where he is.